Today I'm going to be covering the world that me and my friends have developed, because we've been working on this for a while. We've done some recent world building, and there's some aspects of this that we've been discussing for many months. Others more recent. Today I'll be tackling the fundamentals of the world, like things we've established, mainly the physical aspects. Later, once things are more worked out, might cover more of the creature side, because we don't have many creature designs or plant life or anything. That's because we're narrowing our way down. There's also some language aspects that I'll cover later sometime, but there's a small portion. So the first is the layers, the framework. For spatial purposes, it's an infinite flat world. So, I forgot to install my driver. Okay, I installed my driver. That was okay, cool. I have this here just to explain some basic things, because I think it'll help a lot. So, framework, it's infinitely flat. So, you've got Earth, we've got our planet, and we've got our moon, and we orbit this big system around the sun, right? That's how it is. That's not the scale. But this is just a completely different spatial setting. There's no concept of planets or stars or moons or anything. The way the world is set up is it's just infinite flat like this, right? So there is no concept of being another planet up here somewhere. There's no stars in the sky to see. It's an infinite flat plane, and when you work with infinites, it's really confusing, because we have to figure some things out. Like, for example, what's up? What's up here? What happens up there? Or what's down? And with matter compression, what's stopping infinite down from becoming a big black hole under the world? So we have to work out things like that. The sky is, empty and blank, but it does emit, there is a light, a very bright light that comes from all of the sky. There's not specifics for why yet, but what matters is that it does do that. So it'd be kind of like this, right? It emits this light, and it shines on the ground level here. Next is the normal height. We'll call this the normal height. This is called the void. This is the normal height. This is the average height of the world. It's the void. The name will make sense later, but all that really matters is most of the world is this height. And then there lies the normal height, the void, and then there's the raised land, which is the islands. So the islands are up here, right? And their slope up to them is something like this, and they're fairly infrequent in comparison. So this height, this is a not to scale drawing, by the way, but this would be around 2 miles of height. That makes this, 2 root 2, or about 2.8 miles of walking on this diagonal. It's roughly 45 degrees. And then in between these, you've got this stuff called the fog. And all between the islands, it doesn't persist. It is above the islands, like this, but it doesn't go over them. And that'll make sense later. But this causes darkness down here, right? Because this fog covers everything. You can't see anything down here. It's completely dark. And that's why it's called the void. But there is this concept that is here. There's microbes in the air. Really, microscopic, right? You can't see them, but they're everywhere in the sky. And there's so many of them that they actually block out some of the light, and they dim it. So the light towards, once you get down here, would be more dim. Something like this, that might be a little dark. Yeah, this gray is about how dim it would be, because there's just so many in the air that as you go down, and these microbes survive sort of on a photosynthesis type interaction, where the light that is provided, they're reacting with that, and that's how these exist up here. They can exist down here, but typically stop once you get down to the surface. To the specifics of the islands are where most of the creatures in the world live. So they typically span, these islands, they typically span about 200 miles. So this distance is about 200 miles. It's not to scale because this is 2 miles, right? If you want a scale for that, that's like the state of Washington. There are infinite of them, right? Infinite world, weird, but you know, and they are quite far apart. Any given 2 islands, on average, are a minimum. So like, this is again not to scale, but the minimum on average is 200 miles apart. So like, this would be 200 miles, and then they'd be 200 miles apart from each other. But that's not like the rule. They can be much further, but they typically don't get closer than that. The ecosystem is odd, to say the least, and it's very competitive. Most of the islands have tall tree-like plants that block out most of the sky. The trees survive off the microbes in the air rather than photosynthesis. The actual plants down here don't. They survive off the microbes, and the microbes are sort of like the photosynthesis of this world. It's what most of the plants survive off of, rather than the sunlight itself. But trees is what we're calling them because they're going to serve the same functions as a tree. They create like a canopy on this world. So like, this is very not to scale, but say there's trees here, and they create this like kind of blockage. So anything down here can't, any microbes that dip down are just taken by the trees instantly. So any plants down here, they can't use microbes to survive, or at least not as a primary survival function. So the plants have to survive as other methods. Many of the plants rely on carnivorous means as a result. This could span from small plants that kill just bugs up to plants that can kill entire, like, large living creatures. The color of the plants is very diverse, as plants in our world have chloroplast in them that does photosynthesis. But since photosynthesis isn't here, there's no photosynthesis, the chloroplast, which makes the plants green, isn't present, so the actual color of plants varies a lot more. There's a lot of biomes present, so you have the dense, like, forests, right? So this is most of the land. It covers most of the island's cover. They create the canopies, the competitive environment. The temperature of the forests is a little higher because the canopy of the trees creates an insulating effect, right? Then there's just the ordinary forest, which usually lies on the edge of the dense forest area. The biome doesn't typically act as its own biome, but connects 2 different biomes. However, it can exist as its own, and on occasion is its own place. The biome is not home to as much carnivorous plant life due to the less competitive nature of the forest area. With less trees, there's less fighting for the microbes. The forest would be home to, like, dormant plant life that gets its energy from other natural processes, but on occasional animals that live off the plants. Think like a rabbit, you know, something like that. Predators here would be far fewer, as there's significantly less places to hide for a good ambush, and the overall increased visibility leads them to avoid these regions. If you have the super dense forest like this, then it would like start to, you know, become less dense as you go, and this would be the place they avoid. There's the open plains, where there's basically no tree-like organisms anywhere. There'd be almost completely open sky, and this increased visibility created by there being no trees is compensated by dense ground foliage, and they would be able to survive off the microbes as there's no trees. The grass can still be tall enough to obscure vision, but, you know, typically no taller than a foot or 2. So, usually won't, but it can. Then there's the elevated forest. There can be mountains, like, on these areas that exist. It's not impossible, and that would be, the elevated forest would be somewhere along your way up to it, like here. Like, if this is your dense forest, it would be like kind of a connector region. Up in mountainous regions, it's the tallest location. There's usually no tree-like plants anywhere. Little life exists. Creatures specifically evolved to live there can exist. It can't snow in the mountains where the clouds are high enough, but some mountains that are above the clouds have the interesting property, if it's high enough, it actually starts to get warm again. as there is less microscopic organisms blocking out the light as you go up, and that can lead to dry peaks. Essentially, the heat comes from the ground. It comes out of the void, and that's what warms places. So if your island is taller up like this, it'll be colder because less heat's getting to it. If it's lower down, more heat gets out and it's warmer. So as you go up, it'll get colder, but once you get high enough, the light becomes stronger and it actually gets warmer again. Another topic would be this fog stuff here. So the fog, it's odd. We don't have a composition for it. It usually sits at an inconvenient height, as I said. It blocks your view of other islands. So like if you were here, it would be in the way. You wouldn't be able to ever see this island over here. The height of the fog fluctuates up and down in tides at a very consistent rate. Because there's no sun or moon or stars, there's no way to tell the time through the sky. You just simply can't do that, because there's nothing up there to look at. However, the fog fluctuates up and down around in a 50-hour rate. So the fog would go up, it would come back down, and then it'd meet itself back at its same height at around 50 hours of time. So this is a way you can tell time depending on how high the fog is. The fog rises and falls because of the heat from the void, and as the temperature rises, it brings the fog up with it. As it lowers, the fog follows. The temperature change isn't really noticeable, however the fog is displaced significantly due to its properties. After around 250 fog has passed, the fog, it's sort of like a year. The fog will do this thing where this void area completely freezes. It gets really cold, and the fog will drop to the surface of the void, and that will actually make it possible to see, right? So you'll actually be able to see because this fog will drop. About a fog tide later, it rises because of a heat expansion, and then you can see under the fog because the fog would be up here. It's just a result of the heating from the void changing and fluctuating. So let's get to the void then. The void is very dark. The fog completely covers it. You can't see anything. The void is half water, half land. So if you imagine this gray part as water and this black part as land, this is sort of what the void would look like down here. As you can see, sometimes there's big land masses or big water lakes. Sometimes there's lots of land. It varies. If you pick a random spot in the void, there's a 50% chance you fall in water. There's 50% chance you're on land. The terrain of the void is very flat. There's variation. There can be hills and pretty tall hills. There can be deep lakes, but it's usually pretty flat. It is very warm. The bigger lakes in the void heat up the area because of a special substance under them that I'll explain once I get to that area. Few creatures live down there. It's not very viable. It's sort of like the deepest part of the ocean. Most of the creatures that live down there live in the water anyways. When the void gets really cold on the annual fog drop, all the bodies of water essentially freeze over. The temperature drops significantly, and while not a lethal temperature drop, it's a very harsh one. And then, a fog tide later, the larger water lakes, so the deeper ones, will begin to boil. And the temperature of the void increases greatly. Still not lethal, of course. So I'm going to go to the layers image here. So here's sort of a representation of the world. You have the islands that sit roughly 2 miles above, and here you can see this. This says Shiro. So Shi being safety and Ro meaning ground. Islands, this is referred to as Shiro. It's the safe ground that most creatures live at, and it's where the intelligent life that we're working on will exist. This is the fog, so you can see it here. Fog is called Ji. Ji means fog. It casts darkness down here to the void, which is called Ji-Ro, which means fog ground, right? So this is the fog ground. Shu is water, and then ground is just Ro. So that's what that is. And then you can see the heating process here. So water, these deeper water lakes come in contact with this stuff, and we don't have a name for it. We just call it unranium because of kind of a joke that we have. But the point of this is a metal, and it won't be this dense, but this is the representation. The metal is really heat conductive, and it's really effective at doing so. So down here, it's really hot. And because of its heat conductiveness, it actually can carry most of this heat up into the water, and this is where the heating of the void comes from. The ground is not heat conductive, so if you were here, you wouldn't feel this stuff at all, right? But if you were here where it is, this water would be really warm. And when the fog rises from the annual fog rising, this would boil because of that. And I'm going to get to this layer called the molten layer. So as you can see, it's roughly 5.25 miles under the surface of the void. So this is the molten layer. This is where most things become a liquid form and don't persist as a solid anymore. So like stuff right around this area up here, this would be mostly solid still, but obviously as you go down, it transitions into a liquid. The heat causes an enormous amount of stress on all of the ground, and this causes sort of expansion, and that's what the island's rising is. This would be stuff expanding outwards, and this pushes up a lot of the land, so this would be a huge elevated portion as a result of that. And they create these giant caves that can be upwards of 2.5 miles tall, right, which is a very far drop. The part where it breaks off is at the molten layer, so this would be the liquid stuff that doesn't really have a solid form. So the cave, only the solid stuff actually rises upwards. These caves are way too hot to survive normally. It's just way beyond hot. The unranium is heat conductive. It's what causes the heat fluctuations in the void. It's not ever really present on the surface, and as a result, as long as you're up here, you probably will never encounter it. For example, let's say this is like conducting up here. When this heats up from like a fog rising, this could it could be a lethal amount of temperature because of how much heat it would conduct from the ground. So while not present, in rare cases it could be, and because of its high melting point, it doesn't actually emit any light even at a lethal temperature. So the only thing you would feel is a heat rising, and you'd want to evacuate immediately. The people that live here, we don't have a name for them. We call them the Jedu people. Jedu is just their word for person, so it's kind of like saying person people, which is funny. But there's a few basic parts of the language that are worth covering. So that being, I've covered the islands, right? The Shiro, the Jiro, and these are fog, void, and land. These have names as they would be well understood concepts that exist. So they would live here and they'd have a well-known name for this. They'd see fog always, and they'd understand that this place exists down here. However, the cave roofs, the floor, the molten zone, this is all stuff that you would need advanced technology to reach, and the names for them they wouldn't be as historic. We don't have actual names for them yet because we are still developing the early language, but this stuff also isn't as important because you wouldn't discover this until you had way developed technology, because this is miles underground, and this is like unlivable heat down here. So, obviously the names of these places don't really exist. I was explaining the forest earlier. This is sort of like a random example drawing. You can see the tall tree-like things, and then these could be different plants with all the different color types and rock. The ground is just a completely different color, right? There's no consistent coloring system because none of them share any properties. And over here, this is what a fog drop could look like. You can see the distance between these land masses here, and you can see the fog below where it normally wouldn't sit. Normally you would just be obscured completely by this black wall. Once we've finalized this, we can start working on the ecosystem a lot more, but that'll be really interesting. And we've just come around to finishing the actual terrain and physical properties of the world, and when that's done, I think that'll be really great. The void does have some biomes. So first of all, there's the edge, which is the area that is here, and there'd actually be plants that use chemosynthesis off of the fog, because the fog, it is possible to use it for chemosynthesis, and it would exist here. However, most other plants wouldn't exist. And then there's the cliffs. This is more towards like this area down here. As you work your way down, it gets more warm and humid and much darker. There isn't really any life that exists there as there's little things to sustain on living. And then there's heated lakes. These heated lakes, they'd be prominent. They're more referring to deeper lakes, and they allow life to use chemosynthesis from this stuff down here, the heat created down here. This creates pockets of life around the areas, and lakes could have their own unique life ecosystems. A majority of the life is present in the lakes rather than in the void. There's lots of underwater fauna. One of the most prominent is the moss in the water, and it glows, and it is on like the underwater surface, like deeper in the lakes, and it has a bioluminescent glow. It's one of the few areas of the void where you can see anything because it actually emits light. Some plants exist outside the water nearby, as well as creatures on the outside the water, but they're usually be creatures that live in water and land. They don't have any unique land-only life, right? So that would be sort of some basic concepts for the void. There'd also be places like Unranium Flats where there's parts where Unranium sticks up and they're barren, heated wastelands that you can't interact with really. Where it stands, that's the layout going forward, and I think it'll be really cool. That's all that I have done for now. I have a lot of time going forward to work on creature designs and stuff, so I'll definitely be doing that, and when that's done, you expect to see that. Hopefully it was interesting.